So I firstly want to thank you all for coming here this afternoon as we now set out Sinn Féin's plan to fix our broken international protection system and to create a fair and humane system that works. This is a very significant intervention from our party. Our approach is very different to that of government. At the heart of our policy is community, the need for engagement and dialogue, and a new approach which moves away from a policy based on private profiteering to locating centres only in areas with the capacity and services to support them. Fáilte gach duine inniu, tá an policy atá againn anna difriúil ón rialtas, chuireann sé an pobl I grí lór an policy agus cearta déanna freisin. This policy outlines a system that recognises both the pressures that many communities are under and the needs of those seeking international protection. As Irish Republicans and a party of the left, our policy is rooted in our values of equality, anti-racism and human rights, and stands firmly with working class communities that have been neglected and forgotten for generations. We take the approach that specific and practical actions are needed to deliver a system that works well, works quickly, where the rules are applied, where fairness is paramount, and where people are treated with dignity and local communities treated with respect. Our plan is built around 5 key actions. Firstly, ending private profiteering and moving to state-run accommodation. Secondly, locating new centres only in areas that have the capacity and the resources to support them. Third, and crucially, responding to the right of communities to be heard and listened to by creating a standard and transparent approach to community consultation, including the right to make submissions to IPAS. We also want to ensure fast and fair decisions by trebling the number of staff across the system. This would facilitate safe returns and, where required, deportations for those who are not eligible for international protection. Those who are granted asylum must be integrated into our communities and into Irish society. These are people who want to use their skills, their abilities to contribute positively to the country which gives them refuge and which they will call home. And finally, we want to end the two-tier system so that all those seeking international protection are treated equally, irrespective of where they come from. Perhaps more than any other Western country, we know the societal, economic and the human impact of forced emigration. As conflict, poverty and the climate crisis force more and more people from their home countries, Ireland, as part of the international community, must do much more to help address the causes of migration. What we need in the here and now is a fair system that works. Sinn Féin's plan is shaped by common sense and the lived realities of people's lives. The plan is about creating a fair system that works, a system that safeguards the cohesion of society for all who call Ireland home. A system that ensures fairness for local communities, decency, common sense, the protection of human rights, and that also commands public confidence and support.
This marks a significant and substantial intervention by Sinn Féin in terms of policy in relation to international protection and migration. We want to establish the principles for an international protection system that is effective and humane for those fleeing persecution, that makes decisions quickly and efficiently, that ensures the dignity of those arriving in Ireland, but also takes account of the needs of communities that are being asked to host IPAS facilities. The system that we have is broken at every level. It fails asylum seekers, it fails communities, and it undermines confidence in the system. The follow-up in terms of enforcement, where decisions are arrived at, is inadequate. The conditions that asylum seekers are being accommodated in, from tents on streets to under-resourced IPAS centres, is an example of a system that isn't adequate, that is not compliant with human rights, and is humane on the most basic levels of individual dignity. We believe that IPAS centres need to be located in communities that have the ability to support them in terms of resources, and that they should be open to inspection, the Children's Ombudsman and HICWA to report on standards. We believe that the state should be leading in relation to this, moving away from the reliance on privately provided accommodation that has generated significant profits for private individuals. We want a new and transparent and inclusive process of assessing the suitability of potential IPAS accommodation sites. Pre-assessment of sites should become normal practice. The system works better where centres are located in areas that have the services and capacity for them. We need to ensure that communities are properly consulted, that they have the opportunity to have their say, to outline what their community needs and why this may or may not be a suitable location. Other parties, in my view, have shied away from addressing this. I think it's important for all parties, but parties of the left in particular as well, to ensure that they are vocal in relation to these issues and that they are providing answers. I'll now just give a quick outline of some of the key recommendations in the document. I think you all have it. In relation to, Mary Lou has, I think, well articulated the priorities, the key proposals that we have made. That is in terms of ending the private profiteering and a move to state-run accommodation, put centres in areas that have the capacity to deal with them and where services exist to support them, creating a standard, transparent and consistent approach to community consultation, including opportunity for submissions, to treble the staffing across the system, to allow for fast and fair decisions to be made, and to allow greater follow-up where orders are given, to ensure that those who are not eligible and who do not have a claim for international protection that's properly grounded actually leave, to end the two-tier system so that those seeking international protection are treated equally with respect to where they come from. In relation to faster and efficient decision-making, we propose to triple staff numbers at the International Protection Office from 400 to 1,200 and tripling resources for the Appeals Tribunal also. We're also proposing a change in legislation that the International Protection Act 2015 would be amended to allow for partial designation of some countries as safe, which would facilitate greater use of the accelerated processing. Currently, making decisions can take, in some instances, up to 18 months. We believe that that can be significantly reduced, and the accelerated procedure allows for that to happen within several weeks. We also believe, and this is an area we've already done some work in relation to, we need to resume bilateral arrangements with Britain where people who have made asylum applications in the other country can be returned and vice versa. This has already been raised with Keir Starmer. Clearly, when we share a common travel area, there needs to be strong cooperation between Britain and Ireland. With a new British government, there's an opportunity to reset that. We have already raised this with the new Prime Minister. We will be continuing to try and deliver on that. It is absolutely essential that there's good cooperation. In terms of enforcement of decisions, there needs to be greater follow-up in relation to orders where they arrived at, where somebody has made an application, where they haven't been successful. There is very poor follow-up in terms of ensuring that that person has in fact left. We believe the rules need to be applied, they need to be followed up on, rules need to mean what they say they mean. We need to ensure greater implementation of the legal provisions for fines on airlines and other carriers and for prosecution of individuals. We also believe there is scope for further cooperation with Britain in terms of management of migration at ports and airports. Again, bilateral cooperation is essential. Sinn Féin is a party that believes in human rights. Sinn Féin knows that there are many people in the system who are fleeing persecution and conflict whose human rights are being failed. They're in substandard accommodation and that needs to be addressed. We want to invite the Children's Ombudsman in particular and HICWA to periodically report on the standards of international protection accommodation. We want to shift the balance that is there on government that has for many years, first of all, ignored the problems, refused to build the kind of accommodation that was needed, and subsequently trying to beg, steal and borrow private accommodation all over the state. We need to shift that. We need to shift it to a more publicly owned and publicly run system for a number of reasons. It allows us to be more strategic, locate them in the proper areas. It also represents better value for money, and it can ensure better standards as well. Accommodation centres need to be located in areas that have the capacity to deal with Accommodation centres need to be located in centres that are in areas which have the capacity to deal with them and have the services that exist to support them. That is absolutely essential. We believe that there needs to be pre-screening and an audit of the services that are available in that locality. That needs to take into account several things: GP, school places, proximity to transport, but also very particularly existing levels of disadvantage in areas that should involve that should very much govern the selection of locations for accommodation, and the public HB deprivation index is a key part of that. Community consultation is an absolute mess at the minute. In many instances, it hardly exists at all, and very often it only focuses on elected representatives. Community consultation needs to involve the community, and it needs to ensure that local communities actually have their say, are actually consulted. So there is a haphazard approach. It is very different depending on locations. Maybe some good experiences, but more often than not pretty bad experiences. We believe in the creation of an honest, consistent, multi-departmental and multi-agency approach to community consultation. There needs to be a community services audit, as I've said, in relation to any reception centre, outlining what capacity exists in terms of medical, educational, community transport and housing services. There also needs to be a structured form of consultation. This can happen without legislation that creates a designated portal that people can put in place submissions and observations, that people can identify what are the shortcomings in that community. And bypass would be obliged to have regard to this issue of public response and indeed most appropriately act on foot of it. In relation to integration, we know there's a huge appetite out there among communities to ensure that people are integrated into their communities. In many instances, we are talking about new Irish citizens, once they have their status, that will play a key and full role in Irish society. There's huge appetite out there. Most of the funds that exist are oversubscribed. We believe that the funding should be increased, and that an audit should be undertaken to ensure that the money is being properly targeted. In March 2026, the Temporary Protection Directive will be coming to a conclusion. We believe the government needs to provide a roadmap in relation to that. There is no clarity there. That is no good for people from the Ukraine who are fleeing Putin's terrible war of aggression against the Ukraine, but there is no clarity for the public generally or for the system. That isn't right. When that comes to a conclusion, we need to have a sense much in advance of that, of what is going to happen at the conclusion of that. In our view, it is the case that there will be several options. People will be in a position to apply for work permits, people will be in a position to apply for international protection, and there will also be, we believe that we should examine an assisted return scheme as well. But ultimately, there needs to be a roadmap. The Temporary Protection Directive will come to a conclusion. It is a temporary piece of legislation at the European level, and it needs to be brought. There needs to be a roadmap as far as the Irish government is concerned. We also believe that there needs to be equal treatment of people, regardless of where they're coming from. Everyone fleeing war and oppression needs to be treated with the same level of dignity and respect and conditions as any other. And there are several elements to that, many of which we've articulated before. In relation to medical cards, we believe in a universal healthcare system. We want to move to a situation where healthcare is available to everyone, not on the basis of their income. However, while there is a means test, it is our view that the same means test should apply to everyone across the board. The EU Migration Pact is an issue that has been long articulated. It has been passed. We fear that the government has tied the hands of future Irish government. We think that that is a mistake. We believe our particular circumstances were very particular with the common travel area, with the border, and that we should have maximised our flexibility. They didn't do that. They've tied the hands of future governments. What we need to do now, if Sinn Féin were in government, is, as legislation is being passed, to maximise Irish sovereignty to the greatest extent possible, and to put a focus on human rights as these pieces of legislation are being transposed. So that's the table of contents. They're the key issues. Is piece of rock is policy suntasuk seo, is policy dorir seo, a current on pobl ikrilor on policy. Akanen kinchde will carta dana tefigs dina ta topton shoigler costant go will kaidan rezunta agus qui akko agus gomin na honid akor in oitna atana shervi she kun kinti yenete ganairi in na honid.
Gurmaigad agus marit rete ag don hainsin wheel céine me na héna dúir seo go bhfuil sé inta táhairta go bhfuil should féiráte go to den cantar cart agus go just again phobal be part than the Kenya show agus go just again phobal be agus turmi an nachtu hagen stage ag fasta go wilgus in stage get hen mass nu in the public show or you an infrastructure at their well the publication or you scald day or you doctor trailer day or you cursi umper day agus fasta motan publication ag foliage marial gur counter me one touch the agus na me an stage lucky Kenya la cheru brew a horror contra na will na haku yaku la de la listen brution as Donohoe said, and indeed anybody who is engaging with this system over the last number of years, the big myth is that there is engagement or meaningful consultation. Any public representative, any community leader across the state will tell you that that is simply not true, that there is no needs assessment carried out in relation to communities and where new centres are being opened or contracts are being signed into, and there's no engagement with community leaders or an opportunity for individuals to offer their opinions in relation to that. And that needs to come to an end. And as part of this significant policy that Sinn Féin is outlining today, we are outlining the criteria that we would have as a party that would look at the centering of new centres, and that requires that the needs of the community would be assessed, a full assessment of needs of the community which are hosting and planning to host refugees and asylum seekers. And what does that take into account? It takes into account the infrastructure that is there, the availability of GP services, of medical services, the availability of school places, the availability of transport, the availability of other services in the community, and the fact that that community may or may not already be a deprived community that is suffering under disadvantage. All of those issues have to be taken into account. We can't have a haphazard approach, which is what we've had up until now, where no assessments of needs are carried out, and the only assessment or the only criteria that the government are using at the minute is whether a premise is available, mostly in the private sector, which is making people very, very rich. Indeed, people have become multi-millionaires as a result of the failures of the government's policy. It is about identifying suitable location through a pre-assessment of needs of the community, and that needs to be the norm in the future. So it is very clearly saying to areas that don't have the capacity to take on new centres, that under a Sinn Féin government that would not be the case, that we would be looking at a pre-assessment in terms of the locations. We would be looking at a consultation process as Donohoe outlined, and new centres would be located in locations that have the capacity to welcome and adapt in terms of the new centre and the individuals who would be there. In my view, part of this policy, and this policy deals with obviously a human rights approach, a fair approach in terms of capacity, but this is absolutely crucial that the government get this right, that they start listening to communities, they start engaging with the communities, and they don't take communities for granted, and part of that has to be the needs assessment that we are calling for to be carried out.
As things stand, the current system doesn't recognise the pressure that many communities are under or the needs of those who are seeking international protection. The current system is not working for anybody. We need a system that is humane and human rights based, and that's what we have here today. This is a significant intervention from Sinn Féin. It is necessary because of a recognition that the current system isn't fair and isn't working. It's not fair on asylum seekers, and it doesn't recognise the needs of communities. As Irish Republicans, and as a party very firmly on the left, our plan is rooted in our values of equality, anti-racism, human rights, and stands firmly with working class communities who have been neglected and forgotten for generations. Sinn Féin will create a standard, transparent and consistent approach to community consultation and engagement, including opportunities for submissions, so that community voices can be heard. Sinn Féin will create a system that recognises and respects the humanity and human rights needs of applicants, ending the current unworkable two-tier system so that all of those who are seeking international protection are treated equally, irrespective of where they come from. Equality, respect and human rights are at the heart of our vision. And we know that this is the only way that we can work together with communities to deliver a fair system that works for everybody.
Okay, so that's us. Joe, are you going to manage who comes and sits, and I will get to all of you. So
questions and answers concise. We will try and get as many people as possible. Sandra.
Mary Lou, could I ask you, in terms of the consultation and the pre-assessment for local communities, what criteria are going to be used to assess whether somewhere has the resources, and who makes that decision about whether it does have adequate resources? And will communities have a veto? Because government has been very clear that communities do not have a veto.
thank you, Sandra. And I think the government used this issue of veto to dodge the question of their failure to consult, to engage, to dialogue and to listen. We live in a democratic society, and in so many processes people have an opportunity to be consulted, to make observations, to make submissions. That never grants an individual citizen or community a veto. And yet, it seems almost uniquely in this set of circumstances, a government that fails to consult and fails to listen reaches automatically for a veto. We are not talking about a veto. We are talking about respectful conversations with the community. And as Piers has said, that hasn't been happening. And as a matter of fact, in many communities, the government's insistence and repetition that consultation has happened aggravates the situation. So we are talking about a process that involves a local audit of services and service shortfalls on the ground, a process that uses the Pubble Index, as has been referred to, but also other data from the census and from the CSO. And that has to be at the heart of this approach. For all of this to work, and it has to work, the issue of social cohesion, the issue of public confidence is absolutely critical. And a politics or an approach that disregards entirely the lived experiences of people on the ground, that ignores entirely the fact that some communities have been left behind for generations and are stretched, their resources are stretched beyond capacity. That approach doesn't work, and I think we have the evidence of that. So what we want is that respectful approach. We believe that these engagements can actually be very powerful. I know going into any community that I know, it is not difficult to find the stakeholders and the community leaders. They're very evident in communities. And Irish people, you know, are good people. They're generous and they're decent. They want to be engaged and they want to be heard when a change such as this is proposed for their community.
Mary Lou, thank you. The phrase locations with capacity rather presupposes ipso facto better off areas rather than areas that are disadvantaged, as you said. Are you calling for IPAS centres to be located in middle-class areas, not to put too fine a point on it? Can I ask you in relation to Coolock, should therefore the IPAS centre effort at Coolock be abandoned? Can you shed any light in relation to what you spoke about with the Taoiseach in that regard? He asked you for your support. And in relation to maximising Irish sovereignty, aren't you actually seeking to maximise the Sinn Féin vote at the next election?
So, obviously, some areas, and you can objectively measure this, have better access to services, to infrastructure. They are better off. And yes, it is our belief that it is a fairer ask that these centres be located in communities such as those. Let me add as a caveat, our bigger ambition is that no community is left behind anymore, and that we don't have these black spots of deprivation and neglect. I spoke with the Taoiseach on the issue of consultation and dialogue generally, but specifically on the issues around Coolock. And look, the facts are these. If you were starting from the start, would you place this centre in one of the most deprived communities in the state? No, you wouldn't. Would you attempt to do that with no regard to that reality and no consultation with the community living there? No, you wouldn't. Government have now signed a contract with the private individual. Matters are moving ahead, and at this point, the absolute imperative is that that dialogue has to happen. And in my opinion, it has to happen very urgently, and I shared that view with the Taoiseach. I shared with him also the view that simply, and I wrote this in my letter to him, that simply repeating that consultation has happened, it is doing nothing to rectify the situation, and in fact, in my opinion, has added to community anger. So, government now need to get their act together. I think they need to move very, very swiftly, because what has been created is a very unacceptable situation of community anger and deep frustration, which is well grounded, may I say, but also a scenario where others, a small element, but a dangerous element, are now stirring the pot. We've seen violence, we've seen injuries, security guard, members of the Garda, members of the public. We want that to stop. We want Coolock to be a safe, calm place where people are listened to. The last piece of what you asked me,
maximising national sovereignty, is that all about maximising the Sinn Féin vote to the next election?
well look, we're not in an election campaign, we've come out of an election, and we were on doors all across the state, and we did our review, you're all familiar with that, and we were told in no uncertain terms that people and the communities that we represent weren't hearing us loudly enough, saying simply that they don't have the resources, the support that they require, and that government, bad enough neglecting them and leaving them behind, then come along and place a further demand on very limited resources and don't even have the respect to have a proper dialogue or a conversation with them. So are we responding to that reality? Yes, we are. We're not chasing anyone, Senna. Just want to be clear about that. I had an experience last week where a threat was made against me, against my life. I had to go and talk to about that with my kids, with my mother. The toxicity and the danger in this situation is real, and we are very, very conscious of it. And not just for us as public figures, but this is awful for the good people of Coolock. This is awful. The same community that only weeks ago, after 43 years of struggle, the same community that got finally an apology and a recognition from the state for the deaths of 48 young lives, so many of them from Coolock. That's the community that we're talking about. And they can't be lauded one day and then vilified the next. That's not fair. And it's not a reflection of the reality on the ground. We deplore racism, and we will face it down every single time. There is no place in Irish society for that. That will stretch and challenge the cohesion of our society. And we will not accept either the stigmatization or name calling against poor communities who are simply saying we want to be heard and we have been left behind, because that too will stretch and threaten the cohesion of our society. And in a nutshell, from a values basis, I would say that that's where we're coming from on all of this. And I'm aware those are not short answers, so I will now try and be brief. Barry.
So are you saying that the Crown Paints factory in Coolock should not be used then as an accommodation centre? And just the number of asylum seekers who've arrived in the first 6 months of 2024 is up 95% compared to the same period last year. So is it a case that no matter who is in government, can't pick and choose where accommodation centres are going to be given the current situation?
You see, I think if you look at the totality of our proposals, one of our proposals is around efficiency of processing of application, and that's not an insignificant proposal because we know, and I'm going to reach for the percentage.
I think just on that point, like as Mary was saying, the efficiency, the resourcing of the system isn't just to put people in for the sake of it. 2/3 of applications that came in last year looking for international protection were refused. And so therefore you're talking about thousands of people who will likely be refused capacity. It also has an issue of people who are fleeing war and persecution where they're being delayed in terms of their decision and their status. So by actually resourcing the system, what you're doing is ensuring that those who are entitled to the protection of the state are giving it at a quicker point, but also the 2/3, for example, if that were to continue, that those numbers would be given an early decision, and then there would be a follow-up, as Donnahoe says, in relation to making sure that they are returned home safely, and that frees up the issue of capacity. So it's not just about always looking for additional accommodation, it's actually how we're dealing with the accommodation that we have at the minute, and given what the government are doing and the slowness and the sluggishness of the issue, what we have is a huge blockage within the system.
As regards where the accommodation is, certainly when you are totally flat-footed, as the government has been, with no real plan and just reactive all of the time, they have just reached, it seems, for wherever is offered to them from private providers. What our policy sets out, and by the way, this was signposted 5 years ago by Catherine Day, is planned public initiatives. That's what needs to happen here. Because, let me say this, the world that we live in, the reality is that people, it's not like the world of yesteryear. People travel and move a lot. And as we say in the introductory part of our policy, the realities of poverty and war, climate change itself, it means, and it is going to mean, big movements of population. So the challenge for the world and the challenge for Ireland is to have systems that are fair, that are equal, that enjoy public confidence and support, and that are efficient and human rights compliant. Those are the ingredients for it, but you have to, of course, plan for that. That's not going to happen automatically.
Jennifer?
You mentioned the stigmatization of communities there. Who do you think it is recently that has been guilty of stigmatizing the communities, or what specifically are you referring to there? And can I also ask just about the policy in relation to partial designation? How exactly would that work? Okay. And finally, could I also get your reaction to Joe Biden stepping out of the race?
Of course you can.
Thanks.
So, I've been talking to a number of people. This is how the stigmatization point landed most strongly with me. I was talking to mothers in particular in the community, and they told me that they're absolutely broken-hearted that this is all playing out. Lots of them, by the way, don't want the centre there, just so I'm not misrepresenting their position. But as regards the young people in particular, they said, well, here we are, we had 43 years of fighting in respect of the Stardust. The big lie was put around that some working class kid was to blame for that inferno. We get our apology. That's a big moment for this community. And then only weeks later, again, the commentary, I think a lot of it on social media, but calling names, pointing fingers, you are this, in a way that's very dehumanizing to young kids. And by the way, there's all sorts down there. There's kids just being kids and gawking and getting involved. There's another element that's criminal. And by the way, the Gardaí need to grasp that, and they need to have every resource to grasp that. But not for a second should anyone imagine that because those criminal actions have happened, that is what Kulak is. Or that's not true. And people feel that and feel it very deeply. And I've seen myself on social media commentary about kids because they happen to be working class kids. It's not acceptable. It's not acceptable to talk about people like that, in my opinion. in our opinion. I'm going to let Donncha deal with the partial designation, if that's okay. In terms of President Biden stepping aside, I think it must be acknowledged that he has been a really strong champion of Ireland. He is, of course, a proud Irishman. I think particularly in the course of Brexit, he was instrumental in ensuring that there was no hardening of the border on the island of Ireland. We owe him a thank you for that. The appointment of Joe Kennedy as an economic envoy to the North has been extremely constructive and very, very helpful, and I have no doubt that, and I hope that the United States will continue to be an ally for peace in Ireland. I have to say, I hope also that whoever is the next President of the United States confronts Israel, confronts the slaughter that is ongoing there, stops arming Israel's campaign of slaughter against Palestinians, and actually repositions the United States to a place where it was a long time ago, and that was a very powerful player in brokering dialogue and peace in the Middle East. And today there's an announcement between the various Palestinian factions that they seem to have reached some kind of accord. I just saw it, I'm not in the detail of it, but can I say that is a welcome step. And the nightmare that's happening in Gaza and the West Bank is unthinkable to us and needs to stop, and the United States is a key player in all of that. Partial designation?
Yeah, so...
Okay.
Yeah, sure. There's a garden. The legislation currently...
you're next on the list if you do want to put a question.
Yeah, okay, Claire. Currently, anyone who arrives here can apply for international protection, but if they're coming from what's designated as safe countries, it's generally safe for the general population, then they can be put into the expedited procedure and their case can be assessed in several weeks, right? What we are proposing, and it exists in several European countries, is that it is possible under legislation, it's not currently possible, we want to change the legislation, that a part of a country can be designated as safe, and that part of a country can be designated for the accelerated procedure. Now that's not just a geographic part, albeit it might be in some instances. There are large countries with different political situations in them, but it might also apply to a particular ethnic minority or a particular category of people in other respects, that it might be unsafe for them, but safe for the general population. Again, if it was partially safe in that regard, that person could go through the accelerated procedure. I'd make the point as well, that's not, it has to be taken in association with the additional resources, because you can't do more and more of the accelerated procedures unless you have the additional resources that you need. And like the IPO and IPAD staff are absolutely, completely overwhelmed, more than they have ever been, and that is why we have the proposal of the significant increase, the tripling of resources for the IPO or IPAD. Both of those, I think, will help us very significantly get on top of the backlog and will address to a significant extent the accommodation point that Barry made as well.
Donncha na difriachtaí is smó ar policy tá a cheolú go bhiniu agus an seasamh a bhí go bhí seo ar cheist na níor Harry Charman agus a bhfuil buint ag poblbhar hin le bliana nuas agus táí na dágan áitiile bhfuil buint ag sin leis a policy nniu ro tionchar aige ar a policy.
Si bhí de hir géiste leis an pobl ach tá policy seo buinte agus bunathe ar na principal atá bhain agus an polity public donna atá bunathe a cónanas. An méid atá a gceist an seo chuid bhaide tá sin na principal céine ach tá níos mó sonraí, tá níos mó sonraí ó heh achfaní agus chattá a gceist. Agus an rud táimid a féad an teir tá níos mó corcaige ann ó heh cad is bríle consultation, cad is bríle sin conas gur féidir éiste le pobl islí structúrtha agus islí tá mar géine, thart implantír, conas gur féidir an má ahrú idir príomháide agus I láh an phobal, mar tá go leor daoine duine bhanach chuid airgid, agus conas gur féidir an go mbeadh an córas có éfachach is gur bhíon linn. Currente sin go mór leis an choras, mar éiríonn sé le daoine chuir chuig an choras, le daoine sin an brú ar lóistín, ach den sé citte de freisin, daoine bheith mar sérán ag éarnach don tóchaí, tá an deisicó pórtaglacha ar sochaí níos tapúla agus an dehéid sin.
Louise?
Thank you. Can I just ask about the beneficiary of temporary protection and the kind of your plans there? You said that if Ukrainians, if they're from a part of Ukraine that is unsafe, they can get a work permit or international protection. And I know Piers on the 10th of June on Today FM, you said if it is safe to return to parts of Ukraine at that time, then they will have to return. Can any of you tell me which parts of Ukraine are currently safe, and are you aware that the far-right party in the Netherlands, BBB, is also saying similar sentences? And then secondly, Mary Lou, you speak about communities that are better off, for lack of a better word, or have better facilities that could take refugees. I know you said you're not chasing anybody, but you've talked about social media commentary, and I'm sure you've seen the people saying, well, why are these people not in Dalkey? Why are they not in Ranelagh? Why are they not in Ballsbridge? Is by you saying this that they should be in areas that are better off, for lack of a better word, is that not a bit of a dog whistle to these people?
No, it's not, Louise. People are saying that, I think, because it's an obvious question, I think. I think when you just remember, when you're establishing a centre, a service, a place to call home for cohorts of very vulnerable people who are in a place completely unknown to them, surely to goodness, as a matter of just basic common sense, it makes sense to ensure that that place has access to services, access to supports. I think people are using, I don't think it's a dog whistle to anything. I think people are applying just basic common sense.
I don't think that's how they mean it, though.
Well, that's how I mean it. That's how I mean it.
Can you accept that that's not how it
I mean that if you have an area where the food bank is under pressure for the community, and there are communities in this city where the food banks are under pressure. Food poverty is a big thing. Go out and talk to people and they will tell you that. It is far better that a centre catering for people who are making this application is in a community that doesn't have that very direct challenge. And I think that's just a matter of common sense. I'm not dog whistling anything. I'm acknowledging that we have to be sure that we have a system that's based on decency and respect and that is humane, and also has common sense hardwired into it. That's the social media question. What else?
Pardon me? The Ukrainian refugees, which parts of Ukraine are currently safe that people could be sent back to?
So nobody is going back to Ukraine unless and until they can go back safely. The Temporary Protection Directive now runs to 2026. And let me just say, I hope and pray that by that time, all of Ukraine is at peace and is safe. If that's not the case, well then there is a methodology, and I'm going to defer again to my colleague Donnacha. It's not an arbitrary picking out of places on the map. There's a legal way to actually establish what would be considered safe places.
Yeah, again, to repeat that, the Temporary Protection Directive is at the very least going to last until March 2026, right? And what we've been calling the government for is a roadmap for after that date. It is a temporary piece of legislation. It has been extended several times now. And ultimately, it's not any good for any people from Ukraine who are fleeing that conflict, that oppression, that aggression by Putin. It's not any good for the confidence of the system, the whole people having the ability to plan. In our view, once that comes to a conclusion, in general terms, the general migration rules of the country should apply. Now, it's worth bearing in mind that for every other country in the world, we rely on the international protection system. We rely on it to assess whether people are fleeing conflict and oppression. That applies for people coming from the Congo, from Palestine, from Ethiopia, from any amount of war zones and areas of persecution. That is the entire bedrock of our system until this temporary measure came in. So ultimately, if people are at risk of conflict and oppression, the international protection system would support them. In terms of whether areas of Ukraine are safe, we're not proposing that any area of the Ukraine is safe. But if into the future, in any country, an area was to be designated safe or a part of a country, it would have to satisfy the tests that exist in the International Protection Act. So government has in the past brought forward countries and sought to see whether they could be added to the list of safe countries. They were unsuccessful because there is a test in Irish legislation as to whether a country, or in relation to our proposal, or on partial designation, would be safe. That test would still apply, so that would apply in any of those circumstances. But fundamentally, what we want to do is, what we hope happens, is that the conflict comes to an end before 2026. And as and when that happens, there will be a choice for international protection, application for work permits, but also we believe that there is scope for assisted return for people who require assistance to reset up their life in what we hope will be a peaceful Ukraine.
Thank you.
Deputy MacDonald, you've spoken about the need to consult communities on asylum centres, but at the same time you've also said that communities don't have a veto on who lives in their area. So how is that consulting people when they aren't even allowed to say no? What kind of consultation is that exactly?
Ben, thank you for the question, and it's consultation as per every other public process of dialogue and engagement. Is at the heart of our planning system, for example, where people can make their objections, comments, they can bring forward their substantive case and do so in good faith. But they don't have a veto. None of us have a veto in that regard. That's not what we're proposing. And can I just reiterate again, I really think it is not helpful for us to get lost in the veto area, because actually what people are looking for is dialogue. They're also looking for clear information. Clarity of information, even that hasn't been provided to the community. Clarity of information, dialogue, to be heard, to be listened to.
But would you accept that there are some communities who want more than that? I mean, what would you say to a community
what
who
I have
received
said,
all of the information, they know the facts, they've done the engagement, and at the end of that process they still say, we don't want this?
yes, and I don't know any such community who's had the kind of process that we're describing, but in circumstances, I would say to everybody, you have your voice, you have to be heard. None of us have a veto. None of us have a veto. That's not how democratic processes of decision making and planning work.
So even if a community doesn't want
Brian,
it,
we'll move on.
so even if a community doesn't want
Brian,
it,
one question per person. We're trying to keep it as concise as possible. Brian, take it.
Brian, sorry.
Mary, just on this kind of audit criteria that
Yeah.
you set out, what happens if no places in the country, or in fact very few places in the country, meet that set of criteria? What happens to asylum seekers then, or do we load them up in Killiney? And then secondly, would it be fair to say that this move towards this kind of, I think you've been pretty explicit in saying middle class areas need to take on more. Is that in terms of the electoral cycle and the politics of this, is this a very explicit move by Sinn Féin that acknowledges that your core base and working class communities felt that you guys weren't listening to them, and this is you guys saying back to them, we got you, we hear you, and this is what we're saying in response?
So listen, now I've set out for you what we heard in the review. I've been very explicit in that. I think our community said to us, you're not speaking for us, you don't have our backs, you're not reflecting the reality on the ground. And I accept that we weren't doing that with sufficient vigour. But I would also say, if you go back to November 2022 or even before on the floor of the Dáil, I was raising these issues around consultation, engagement, communities under pressure. Now, communities are under pressure, services are stretched, but in many cases it can be a tale of two cities, a tale of two Irelands. Not every community experience is the same. And the reason we're bringing this forward is because this is now a huge matter of public conversation, and it's also a policy area that people need clarity. We accept that people need to know where we're standing with clarity, because it's not something that's going to go away. This is an issue now that Irish society, that Irish communities, and that Irish politics has to deal with. We are, by way of tradition, a country of net emigration. You know, we went places. Now we find ourselves in circumstances where people are coming here. And everything that we've set out is our view of how, in a fair, human rights compliant, efficient, common sense way, you deal with that reality.
But politically, you're sending a very clear message, I think, to the communities that the party principally comes from, by saying middle class communities need to do more. That would be a fair
Well, we've talked.
understanding.
Well, I mean, I don't think there's any secret of the fact that we represent working class communities. Yeah, yes, that's true. We also represent people beyond that cohort. Like we're quite a broad church at this stage. I think we're sending out a message of common sense and of fairness. That's what I think. That's
like this is common sense. Like look at the lived experience of people in communities. I represent Donegal. We have a situation where new centres or contracts have been entered into where the GPs lists are all closed. Like they're closed. You can't get access to a GP. And so why would you make a decision to actually locate there over somewhere else? And of course there are places that, as Mary Lou says, it's not the case that everybody is on the is deprived as every other area. You carry out the needs assessment. It's basic things. Is there availability to GPs? And if there isn't, then why would you actually locate additional people in that community that is going to put further pressure? We have an automatic entitlement to the GP service, which is going to put automatic pressure in a community that's already stretched. Or whether it's education, or whether it's the issues of deprivation, or the food banks that Mary Lou is talking about. So this is just about, for the first time, a political party is setting out a criteria as in relation to where centres would be located in the state. It is about making sure that we have a planned system as opposed to what we have at the minute. Years on, we have an emergency haphazard system, as I said, that is completely based on greed and profit from speculators in the private sector. We get phone calls from the so-called community engagement team to say that there's a new centre being opened in your community. We ask them questions, what about capacity? Is it, did you check out capacity, GP service, education? None of it. They don't. They tell you that they're not checking for that anymore. That's not the way to deal with communities. It's the way to get the backs up of the communities, and it's not the way to locate centres of people who are fleeing persecution and war to actually to treat them also. So there is a true process here. It's a process of one, that there's consultation with communities, but also there's a process here for the state themselves to make sure that these centres are being located in the spaces and in the areas where the resources are there to deal with them, where they have capacity. And there's many of them across the state. What we've seen, unfortunately, is that it is very much in the main disadvantaged areas that have to take large numbers of these up until now.
Claire?
Just on that point again, has Sinn Féin sort of developed or established its thresholds in relation to that? Say how many patients per GP it considers to be acceptable before moving people in? Has it gone through that level of data yet? And then on the work permit system, would Sinn Féin make it easier for people to come here and work with, at least speed up that system?
So on the work permit system, I might defer to Louise. And by the way, we're conscious this is one slice of kind of wider migration policy, but do you want to make a comment on that?
Yeah, there is very clear case for reforming the work permit system as it exists, but also identifying where the skills gaps are, making it more efficient and quicker for people to apply. So I've dealt with cases in my own area where people very much we need their skills, but it took so long for their application to be processed that they actually went to another place where their skills are very definitely needed. So there is a very definite need, and when we talk about increase in resources, that has to be increase in resources right across the board to ensure that where we have identified that skills deficit, that we can take people, we have the mutual recognition of qualifications. Where that doesn't exist, we have a system to assess qualifications and get people in and working as quick as possible.
How quick would that system be?
That entirely depends on the skill set and where they're coming from, and whether or not there is a significant cohort. But at the moment, we're seeing delays of months, and we believe you could get that down to weeks, and it would give certainty to employers as well. So I mean, there is the system as it currently is working well in some areas. So where there is a clear pathway, where there is mutual recognition of qualifications, it's working quickly. But where that doesn't exist, that's where the deficit needs to be addressed.
Fiona?
Sorry, just on the...
In relation to the criteria, well, we don't have to, just briefly, we don't have to reinvent the wheel in relation to this. We outlined in their document some of the criteria that we would be using. We also mentioned the Pobble Index score, which takes on board not just issues of deprivation, but also issues of health, housing, and so on and so forth. So there is already a criteria that the whole state is broken down into small things that would be fed into decision making in relation to that.
Just two very quick questions. The question that Stan and Barry asked you, crown paints, should it be used or not? If you can give me an answer to that, because it's the third time you've been asking them.
And I've said, and I'm happy to say again, if we were starting at the start, would we have chosen that as a location? No.
Okay,
and certainly,
now are you saying it
but
should
as
be
of now, we're not the government, Senan, and as of now, contracts have been signed.
Yeah.
The government have indicated, I think the Minister for Justice indicated that this was going ahead. I think she's been very explicit. That's the situation now, and in those circumstances, I just think it would be actually irresponsible. I think it is irresponsible of government not to mark an absolute step change in the engagement and the dialogue with the community. We have to deal with where we are now, and that's where we are now. And I actually had a frank conversation, I hope a constructive conversation with on Taoiseach on that matter, and we will be returning to government on that precise point.
And just on your selection criteria for locations where centres can go, can you name 3 places in the whole country where you would say that they are appropriate locations? If I go to Guidor, we can talk about transport. If I go to Toker, we can talk about deprivation. If I go to Skerries, we can talk about school places. So you can pick whatever criteria you want, everywhere you want. Give me 3 places where you say, right, you can put in centres.
But we're not going, and if you don't mind me saying, half of the problem that we've had is that arbitrarily places were just reached for because they were there or because there was a private arrangement.
You're setting a bar so high that nowhere.
No, we're not setting a bar high at all. We don't have to be arbitrary, and it's not for us to pick and mix. The Pobble Index that we have brought your attention to, I'm sure you knew about it in any way, it operates on a scale. So that's the type of data that needs to be used.
But then school places and GP places and transport.
Yeah, and all of
which
those
is
things.
Part of the Pobble Index, which is part of the
Pobble Index.
Yeah,
I might make the point.
And everywhere we'll say then, Skerries is not high up on the Pobble Index.
Can I assist you there? If you're not, can I assist you there? So
yeah.
How we imagine this happening. So if you're pre-assessment, and that's on the basis of criteria and a scientific approach, right? Because the approach that the government has been taking has been completely arbitrary. So what that would do, it was look at all those considerations that you cited, and clearly there are locations that will be completely unsuitable. Where, and there is not going to be any place perfect, but clearly there are going to be places that are going to be completely unsuitable. Where IPAS or the Department of Children decided to proceed, that it wasn't completely unsuitable, what that audit would also do is would identify the additional resources that that community would need. So it would serve 2 purposes. First of all, it would rule out places that are completely overwhelmed, that have no capacity to deal with it, that would be entirely unsuitable. But it would also assist you anywhere that they would be located in identifying, well, what are the investments that we need to make, and that you can bring the problem on the ground an awful lot of time. It's the Department of Children on their own doing all the batting, Department of Education, Department of Health, Department of Transport are nowhere to be seen. So what would need to happen at that stage, once a decision was made to go ahead, that all those departments would be brought in, and the interventions and the investment that they would need to make would need to happen in that community.
Final question, Killian.
Do you envisage that this new consultation process will speed up the opening of new centres or slow them down? I mean, provided they're not burnt down in the interim.
And I know you're adding on the issue of places being burnt as a right to your question, but I don't think any of us should be flippant, and I'm not suggesting that you are about that. I mean, the sight of places being burnt, it's horrifying, it's criminal, and those who are engaging in those behaviours need to face the law. You know, so we shouldn't be, nor should we take it as kind of normal, some kind of new normalcy that kind of behaviour occurs. This approach, properly applied, I think makes the system more efficient. This approach where you actually make an assessment, you carry out an audit, you face reality. You ask, what's happening in this community? What's the capacity like? Infrastructure, services, and so on. It allows you, on the one hand, to rule out locations that are just under too much pressure, but it also then is the metric, as Donnacha has said, where you can assess where this is a goer. However, we will need to bring whatever the resources are to bear. And if you take that approach, in our honest opinion, and you are also prepared to go in and talk with and listen to the community, I think a lot of the heartache, a lot of the divisiveness can be quelled. So I think not alone is this the right way to approach this question, it's also the most efficient way to approach it as well.
Thank
you very much, folks.